Hey, welcome, folks. Welcome to the chat. Shout out to everyone listening after the fact.
Hey, I'm
Yeah,
recording, love.
yeah,
That's
I'm here.
now.
Oh, I'm here with 86 Boxing. We're just a couple minutes late starting. 86 Boxing, what's up, brother?
What is what is going on? Random holding it down. Hey, happy about this. This was great yesterday, just being able to get into some of the dialogue. And I do look forward to this one because it's going to be super intense. Tough calls in pretty much every fight. We might have to throw in draw as an option as well. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah, we did our last show. We did some killer matchups yesterday or 2 days. Was it yesterday or 2 days ago? Yesterday.
Oh, yesterday actually.
Yeah, you're right. And now you can see this one, folks, up here on the screen on the left, the great Joe Jeanette. And we fought in the aughts and the teens, and the mythical Joe Lewis from 30s and 40s. This is going to be insanity. This is only one of only four matchups that we plan on getting to in this installment of the show. 86. This is a tough one. What do you want to try and hit first? You want to hit this one first while it's up? What do you think, brother? It's a tough fight. Tough fight right here. Joe Lewis, one of the great punchers of all time, trained by an old school boxer from Jeanette's era, Jack Blackburn, who actually predates Jeanette as a professional. Jeanette, one of the greatest cardio machines, able to fight in all different manners, just very well balanced fighter with miraculous recovery. What do you say, 86? We jump on this one?
Why not? Because this is certainly one of the more intriguing ones that I've run across. I haven't even thought of it or ever even tried to conceive a potential matchup between the two. So I think this is most certainly a worthy one because it's very, very intriguing.
Yeah, and I think you're looking at in Joe Lewis, you were looking at a throwback fighter of sorts, or a throwback with upgrades. He fought like Blackburn was well aware of the early era style with the smaller gloves and just you know Lewis fought in the era of mouth guards, but Jeanette competed in the era where when he started at least, and they didn't use them. So you get punched is a whole different kind of thing, and it does all the small things, the factors, the count. But I think for this matchup, to be fair to both guys, they're going to fight at least twice, prime versus prime, in once in each of their eras. And unfortunately for Joe Lewis, the early era fight is the finish fight. He's going to step in for Sam McVeigh and fight. And McVeigh went 49 rounds before relenting to the great Jeanette. So that might be tough. Any kind of finish fight with Joe Jeanette's going to be tough because he could take it. But Lewis, one of the all-time great punchers. But I want you to take the floor, 86. What do you think about from your understanding of these great fighters and their techniques? How do you see this going? I don't even know if I can wrap my head around it fully.
Yeah. This is certainly a very, very tough one when you just think about it overall. And man, both of them, I think they stack up pretty well. Jeanette being about 5'11", somewhere around that range, a solid guy. And Lewis being 6'2", I've seen 6'1", I could say 6'2" at the highest, but probably more generally in that 6'1" range. Another just solid guy. I mean, in terms of they're just solidly built physique wise, and they are the types that can carry a heavy load in some sense. So I think that this is one of the tougher ones because you have to look at different lenses. One being some of the stuff you mentioned, the type of gloves, just the time, and generally what you could do and get away with in Jeanette's time versus that of Joe Lewis. You mentioned the mouth guard thing. You also can take into account the when a fighter is down, moving to a neutral corner, and how people operate in that space. Just thinking about during Jeanette's time, yeah, you didn't have to just go all the way back to a neutral corner. You can kind of hover about and just wait for the person to get on their feet and
Hey,
bounce back in.
86. I'm sorry to break in, brother, but I should mention I'm not sure. It might have been that in Paris you had to give the guy the opportunity to get up at that time in '09. I
Okay.
don't. I don't actually remember off the top of my head. If so, there's a possibility that if that specific fight was on, he might have actually. Because I think there's a photo of one of them waiting over by the ref while the other's getting up.
Okay, cool. Good to know then. Yeah. Thanks for that nugget right there. So, yeah, maybe in not all cases that being a true thing to really decipher or give anyone an edge much. So, but then it comes down to skill. Both of them very highly skilled. Jeanette's known for his jab, the way that he could pop his jab out, step back, try and maintain distance. And he had enough pop in his punches that he could get you out of there, especially if he had you hurt and vulnerable. Lewis, on the other hand, we know he would work his jab, but certainly just from a stylistic standpoint, he's one of those guys who had an excellent technique centered around him really keeping himself centered on a fighter. And of course, we know how deadly his hooks are when he's on the inside. And as I always say, Scrapbook Boxing, that's a channel to check out or worth checking out in terms of how he broke down Joe Lewis's style. And I think that is a big factor and a key in this contest as well. Uh, I mentioned body wise, comparably close, I guess you can say, in some sense. So then it comes down to these two mano a mano fighters in the ring being able to handle things as things transpired. And in the fight world, you only have a split second. So both of them had a high level ring IQ. And I think this is virtue of just the sheer number of fights that they had, especially in Jeanette's case, and also just getting that experience against a high level of competition. You could argue the edge on the competition with Jeanette, just given when he fought. It was a pretty rich era for heavyweights, one of the better eras for heavyweights just in boxing history. So I think that you certainly would give him the edge on the competition front. And he fought some of the toughest guys. He fought multiple times. We don't see that as often these days. And it's pretty miraculous when we get some 4 and 5 fight series in general as we've gone over or gone through time. And I think that one of the standout things for Jeanette also is his chin and his endurance, just from being in some long, excruciating fights. Of course, one that always comes up, and it must come up when talking about Jeanette or McVeigh actually, is the fight in Paris, their third contest, which was one of the longest in the sport's history. And I believe it was 49 rounds that the two actually went, somewhere in that ballpark. And you just think about the brutality of said fight. Jeanette was knocked down multiple times. I think I've seen somewhere where they say 27 times he was knocked down, and it was more than Sam Langford. I break this down in a video on Sam McVeigh rather. I break this down in the video on Sam McVeigh, and I don't even get into the full details, but there was just so much going on in that fight as far as they had to be administered oxygen, blood everywhere, both of them losing a ton of blood, swelling, cuts, bruises. It was just a true, just historic fight in some sense, and one that, of course, we won't see here today, or that won't be duplicated, especially if it were the case that it were two high-level heavyweights, which was the case in Jeanette and McVeigh. And I think one of the big things that came out of that was the fact that in the end, it was Jeanette that won the contest. And in doing so, I think he showed that he had a true level of grit, and that the Iron Man nickname is certainly something real. And I think that would be very intriguing as far as him and Joe Louis, and whether Joe Louis, with those short hooks and the way that he can do damage, whether that could actually stop a Jeanette. And it would be interesting to think about it. And In the case of Lewis, of course, we know we've seen a good deal of him on film. In the case of Jeanette, I only recall one fight that I've seen of him on film, and that was against Sam Langford. I don't recall which fight in the series because they fought multiple times, but you could kind of get a glimpse of McVeigh's or Jeanette's style in that contest. And thinking about Lewis and how his style might mesh up, I think it'll all key on the who can control what takes place outside of the middle of the ring, because both of them will have a pretty solid jab. You could argue Jeanette, he worked it a bit more, and I think that if they're going through the process of a chess match in some sense, and they're really looking to get their foot placement and really want to tee off with the best punches that they can land, then it'll be very tactical in the beginning. And I think that a lot of that would take place in the center of the ring. So therefore, what could come into the fold potentially is someone's back being against the ropes. And I know that Joe Louis has shown that when he has a fighter cornered and hurt, then he usually gets them out of there. And that kind of harkens back to what I was mentioning with those sharp, accurate hooks that he would throw. And he would work it from the head and body. And he'd make sure that when he was on a fighter going for the kill, then his accuracy was a top level thing. And so I think that bodes probably a bit more his favor in this contest. But that being said, they're both just very excellent fighters. And I think there's not a ton that separates them if you just look at it from a holistic standpoint. And I know we were talking about this off air random, but just thinking about, the time frames in which they fought, kind of that gap between, and I alluded to something of a similar nature on the Fitzsimmons Archie Moore matchup, but the gap between Jeanette's time and, say, Joe Louis' time, some would say it evolved a great deal. But I think that, some of that could be overstated. I do feel that there were a ton of skillful boxers. And usually if you were at this level, you were the best in the sport in your division and one of the best just across the board, then a great deal of that comes down to the IQ and just the scientific nature in which they operate, how they think in the ring, as mentioned, split second. So I think some of the gains, if any, would have likely been incremental, because there's no way to look at Jeanette and just take into account what he was able to do and just assume he wasn't skilled, and he had the competition to back such. And I think that is something that factors into this matchup as well, because I don't think it's a wide gap. And Jeanette has shown that he is game against one of the biggest punchers the sport has seen in Sam Langford. Additionally, with Sam McVeigh, who was another big puncher and a really aggressive fighter, strong fighter. And I think that bodes well for Jeanette as far as how he might think to operate in order to avoid being stopped or dropped by. Well, maybe he'll be dropped. I could see that happening, but to avoid being stopped by Lewis. And, I just think that Joe Louis, while he had, a hiccup with the Max Smelling fight, they're just thinking about the first one early in their career. I do think that, man, he was such a formidable fighter, and he was highly skilled. And one of the reasonings behind the pound for pound list, or the thought process behind what we consider pound for pound and where fighters rank. And I think that's just a testament to just his overall skill set and the heart of both of these gentlemen, not the type to back down or go out. And Jeanette, yeah, he was stunned at times about some smaller guys, but uh, not Jeanette, but rather Joe Louis. Uh, but it didn't mean that he was still he wasn't any less vicious than what he was, at his peak. So I think that when he got the job done, he really honed in and made sure he could get the job done. And I believe that he would be the type to make sure that he goes about this in the best manner to ensure that he sees victory. And he'll be trained by Chappie, Jack Blackburn, who I would think has the techniques down enough to know that Lewis would have to operate in a different space dealing with the likes of a Joe Jeanette. And I think someone quoted uh, Chappie in saying that the guys from the heavyweights from his era, which would be inclusive of Jeanette, would probably or were probably a bit better than Joe Louis. I don't remember the quote in itself specifically, so that's kind of paraphrasing such, but I do think that you have to take that into account as well. So he's seen some of the best operated, was in the ring with some of them, and he's the trainer of Joe Louis and helped to really solidify him into the man that he was in the sport. So with all that, I do just think that it is one where Lewis would get the edge. And I think it's probably one that would go the distance. I don't see Jeanette just going out quietly. So I think factoring in how many ever rounds it is, especially thinking about the time, say it's 15 rounds essentially, and smaller gloves or whatever it may be. Uh, the gloves in itself could change the dynamic a bit, but I do think that Lewis, he would be prep, primed, and ready to go. And I would call it a late fight decision is probably, or a decision fight essentially, if it's going 15 rounds or somewhere around that range. And I would think that if it's something beyond such, especially how they were doing it during Jeanette's time, then I would probably lean in his favor more heavily because I think he's shown that he can go far beyond the normal realms of a fight as far as rounds are concerned. And I think that is a big piece of how he could use his strength and endurance and his ability to take those punches to take over a fight against Joe Louis on the back end. But with that, I do think Joe Louis would pull it off if they were just meeting under the same or similar circumstances at their best. I think Joe Louis would likely prevail in that, though not by some huge or wide margin. But I think he'll do enough to make sure that he sees victory.
Good stuff, man. Good analysis. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think at least the one that I had seen referenced, the quote from Blackburn, he was thinking Lewis would have beaten Johnson. Of course, he didn't have a good relation. Blackburn didn't like Johnson, so I don't know if we take that with a grain of salt. But at the point of one interview, he didn't think Lewis was quite up to a Langford level. I haven't seen too much. I'd have to look into what he had said about the quote. But I do know that Jack Johnson said that him and his great contemporaries would have. I saw an interview with him saying would have beaten these guys around Lewis's time. But maybe that's a natural thing to think. But there were also extremely tough schedules involved. Like Jeanette, the year. So like just looking at this matchup, I'm not sure what weight Lewis was best at. About 195, you think? Jeanette around 1909.
Yeah.
For the finish fight with McVeigh, although some of that may have been the amount of training he was doing to get ready for it. He was 184 and 3/4. By the end of the season, when they fought again, I think he was in the 190 range. But that sometimes that fluctuation, I mean, if you're training for a fight that literally has no round count, then perhaps you train harder than that 5 pounds. So he might have already been solidly 190. So you got a little bit of a size advantage for Lewis. Lewis also had a very big head. he could take some shots. You know, he had like a literally like a large skull, which could help. But I feel like Jeanette's best way, getting in and out with the jabs to the body. He was very good at getting in and out and high or low. And I think with Lewis's style, it will come down to, okay, how long does it take Lewis to catch Jeanette when he's coming in and out doing that? And can Jeanette close the gap and then clinch with him to stifle those vicious shots, which wasn't easy because Lewis was dangerous in those situations as well, very up close. He had extremely good short power. So I think Jeanette fights an outside game. He fought mobile fighters. He had wins over Jeff Clark, Joplin Ghost, great jabber mover. So Jeanette could move. He could really move. He had that amazing cardio, very intelligent person, intelligent fighter. And I think, 1909, 1910, Jeanette, you could maybe consider that as his best. Full mobility, full fight IQ. He'd already fought Langford, the slightly heavier version of Langford that was terrorizing the heavyweight ranks. So by the end of 1910, he's had just a whole heap of experience. He's fought bigger guys than himself, like Big Sandy Ferguson. I'm not sure if Al Kubiak was much heavier than him. He was a stocky guy, but he beat him. Fought the English heavyweight Ben Taylor. That's someone that Jack Johnson beat right before he went and beat Tommy Burns. He beat him in England. Jeanette also had that win. But he fought McVeigh, giving up about 15 pounds to McVeigh in the finish fight, but they fought 3 times that year. McVeigh got him over 20 rounds, then Jeanette got McVeigh over 49, and then they drew over 30 rounds toward the end of the year. So I got to agree with you, in a long fight, I think it favors Jeanette. And that's true against almost anyone because his recovery was extremely notable, even in a time of hard men, in a time when lots of guys had fantastic stamina and where not everyone was drinking and smoking, partying and stuff like that. Jeanette was a family man. To my understanding, he didn't get into a lot of that, kept to himself. And he was a beast. And but I do in a shorter fight, I think Lewis with that stalking style like Langford had, but he's bigger. He may not be quite as nimble as Langford at his best, who was maybe 15 pounds lighter than Lewis at his best, but Lewis had a hell of a punch, and he did have that guidance from Blackburn, which was informed by the greats of that earlier era, including Jeanette himself. So I think Blackburn, if we're talking about Lewis, who at least within reason proximity of having Blackburn teaching him, if he can have him as his coach, yeah, in a shorter fight, I think the power of Lewis, I think when he does eventually catch him, as long as he manages to catch him real good by the mid rounds, Lewis was a great finisher. And when he was still younger, he could really put it on a guy in flurries. He wouldn't necessarily hit you and then look and see how it's looking. He knew to go for the kill. I don't know if he stops Jeanette. That's a tall order, but I do think in a shorter fight, I'd just favor Lewis to, like in a shorter fight, I would expect Lewis to catch him before, maybe by 4 or 5 rounds, and maybe even with a groggy Jeanette, be able to stay in the lead and win on points. I don't think he's finishing Jeanette. In a longer fight, though, I expect Jeanette to start off winning some rounds, Lewis to catch him. Then by the 10th round, maybe they're fighting even, but then beyond 15 rounds, Jeanette's just going to keep going and keep going, keep going. So if it's a finish fight, and in the smaller gloves, the jabs of Jeanette, he might even close Lewis's eye. In the smaller gloves and no mouthpiece, well, bloody him up with all those jabs. I mean, Jeanette had a really, really good jab, really intelligent jab, high or low. In the footage against Langford, you can see him jabbing to the body and he's gone. In and out, boom, boom. I think that's going to add up more in the smaller gloves without the mouthpiece. So I think I favor Jeanette in the long fight. And in a finish fight, obviously I would favor him to finish Lewis or stop it on cuts. Maybe on cuts, though. Lewis was a phenom, one of the absolute best, if not even the best boxer in the whole sport. Even though he was a heavyweight, he wasn't the largest heavyweight, so he was a terror himself. But yeah, I think I'd have to concur with you. Like edge to Jeanette in a finish fight, edge to Lewis in his own rules, in his own era, especially with the guidance of the great Jack Blackburn, one of the brilliant fighters who went on to coach. I think all of that adds up. Maybe advantage Lewis, but not by much. Jeanette could really punch. He was really clever, and he fought some beasts in there. And McVeigh was a serious puncher moving forwards or backwards. So it wasn't like he hadn't been in with a big puncher. But I think Lewis's style, Blackburn had him so beautifully tuned in and honed in to devastation. So if you're taking Lewis at his absolute best, maybe after the Schmeling loss, like when he learned, are we considering his prime after that fight when he's gotten even better?
Yeah, that's a good question right there. Yeah, I think you have to look at it from both of those lenses, and that experience came for Lewis, as you mentioned, and I do think that yeah, if we look at it from them both being experienced, then yeah, it still plays into Lewis's favor. But yeah, the pre version that got knocked out by Max Millen, maybe that version in some capacity gets a win in just a regular fight. Uh, in the case of Joe Jeanette, that is, gets a win over Lewis. I think it's something that certainly can be argued uh, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if it's from Lewis dropping his hand after a jab, Jeanette is the exact kind of fighter who would see it, identify the weakness, and exploit it. So if it was a, I don't know if he was as hard a puncher as Schmeling. I don't actually know that, but Jeanette could capitalize on mistakes. He was very experienced by that point. And the early part of his career, he fought a very, very, very tough lineup. So he was in there from the very start. He didn't really get the easy intro to the professional ranks. And so maybe early pre-prime, maybe as prospects, maybe Jeanette gets the best of him, even in the shorter fight. I'm not sure. He certainly had more high-level early experience as a pro. But, Lewis was a phenom from the start. And he hit the gate running. So, yeah, it's a good fight. I think I've probably exhausted my small analysis on it. You want to move to the next one, Josh?
Oh yeah, why not? Let's dive straight in because all of these are going to be tough.
Oh, brother, yeah. So we're in agreement. Edge to Lewis in his own time. Edge to Jeanette in his own best with his best foot forward. So
yeah, certainly.
All right. So we're going from tough to even tougher, man. Out of the frying pan into the fire. Let me pull this up. Oh my goodness, this show gets tougher and tougher. You think this is tough? This is tough, but this is just part of it. Here we go. The Oxnard Cyclone versus Kid Dynamite. We got great Sam McVeigh, contemporary of Jeanette, contemporary of Sam Langford, Jack Johnson, colored heavyweight champ, Australian heavyweight champ. I think I might have held the Commonwealth title. I'm not sure. But McVeigh was a deadly guy. He was capable of fighting at least 49 rounds against Jeanette before he had to relent. Just an iron will, a real tank, and a very similar frame to Tyson, similar height. I'm not sure about the reach, but similar. Maybe Tyson had a slightly thicker neck, but McVeigh was a tank. And he had some thighs on him too. So he was big. With both of them coming in close to 200 pounds. McVeigh was like a career heavyweight. Here's a photo of him when he was young. Look at him. He's already a tank. He already looks 200 pounds from a face-off with Jack Johnson. I just cropped him out. So we're looking at their absolute best. They're similar size, similar dimensions. Tyson, just brilliant offense, peekaboo style. McVeigh, not so much peekaboo style, more of like a long guard and a different way of doing it, but he could fight on the retreat really well, and he could counter like a beast. You could hit him and he could get you right back. Like he was ready. He was tough enough to take it and dish back. But I want to ask you your thoughts on this, Josh. What comes in your head when these two great heavyweights collide, I guess, in each of their eras?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to my mind is that when we think about fighters of today and how they compare to others from the past, I think that Mike Tyson is a very good comp as it relates to what he was able to do and kind of how he handled things stylistically. I think he was a similar comp to Sam McVeigh. So when you think about when you weigh it from that standpoint, then you kind of get an understanding. So yeah, McVeigh, man, big dude. You can see the physique, ripped, muscular guy, and that mirrors Sam, or that mirrors Mike Tyson in the same fashion, because Mike Tyson, as you mentioned, stocky, solidly built guy, and he used that to his advantage, and that's what allowed him to kind of stand out, because he was taught and worked on those things that adhered to his body, his size, and what he could do in the heavyweight division. I would suppose the same with Sam McVeigh. Now, of course, Mike Tyson is one of the most popular fighters of all time. He reached the level and status that is rarely seen. It's up there with the Ali's, the Jack Dempsey's. So those are the heights of popularity that Mike Tyson reached uh, during his era, and even in retirement, he still remains to be one of the more popular boxers. So from as I hearkened on this yesterday as well, from a visual standpoint, you're always going to have a contingent of individuals weighing in who haven't seen any or enough film on Sam McVeigh. Now, of course, we know that there were films that were lost, and therefore they either hadn't been found or they were destroyed in some capacity. But that being said, we have pretty much every fight that Mike Tyson fought, and it's hard to take what you actually saw out of your mind when you just look at it from a casual perspective. And Mike Tyson, he's one of those mythical boxers that he still has a large contingent of, I would just say, the population globally who consider him to be the best heavyweight of all time, or at least a prime Mike Tyson being the best heavyweight of all time. And for Sam McVeigh, while he is probably the perfect comp, you don't hear as many people mentioning him, and partially because they may not know a lot about him. But also, I think it's the film piece that would be the key point. Now, doing research, and I know that you know this, as well as some of the others listening and all that stuff. So, doing research, then, while you don't have a visual reference of Sam McVeigh for all of these fights he participated in, we do have detailed accounts that give you a sense of how he was as a fighter, what he was able to do in the ring, what was his strong suits, and how did he stand out amongst the best during that era. And a part of this meant he fought some of the best heavyweights that were out there, to include Sam Langford, Sam Langford, and Joe Jeanette. He also fought Harry Wills, another top caliber heavyweight who is most certainly one of the greats of all time. Now, in the case of Tyson, he racked up a number of wins. Some of them could potentially be considered great, but at the very top level of the division, in terms of the elites, that's where he kind of saw his downfall, or at least that's where we didn't see him get the job done and get over the hump in a similar capacity to what he had previously done when he was younger in the 80s. And Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield, they were two that rank amongst the greatest ever. And when we think about these all-time greats, they rank amongst them. So they were able to get the victory over Mike Tyson. And some of it, anyway you slice it, comes down to the mental aspect. I think that's a big part of it. In the Holyfield contest, we saw just how that affected him, and even to a certain degree in the Lewis contest, so on and so forth. But I think at the elite level of the division, I think Sam McVeigh did more when you just break down who he was up against. And he wasn't the most skilled of the group of them that were out there, but he made up for that in his explosiveness, his power, just that brute strength. And he was actually a very solid boxer, so he could get the job done going the distance, and he could outbox some of his opponents or a number of them. And he has a record to show this. Um, Tyson, super skilled, great footwork, and man, he was just all around like an assassin in the ring in terms of when he smelled blood, he made sure to capitalize on it. There was no issue at all in most cases because he was getting them out of there. And then you had some fighters who kind of feared what would be as they were getting ready to fight Mike Tyson while they're walking down the ramp and ultimately get in the ring to go through all the particulars, tell the tape essentially. So he had some individuals mentally defeated by that point. I don't think this would be the case against Sam McVeigh, who was a very hard man, rough upbringing, and he used boxing to translate all that he went through, which is the case with Tyson as well, but he used boxing as that catalyst. In polarizing times, it would be certainly different with Tyson fighting in that same era, because one of the things we've seen with Tyson, as I mentioned, is where, when the going got extremely tough, and he did do a ton of great things, but when it got extremely tough against those elite guys, then that's where he came up just a slight bit short. Now, as mentioned, there are two perfect comps, so I'd expect this to be sort of a fireworks type of fight, especially in the early stages of the contest. And I think it would come down to who could get that edge as you battle through attrition, adversity. And you kind of have to lean Sam McVeigh in that regard, just given, as I mentioned, the people he fought and the time frame. Now, it still holds a ton of intrigue because of the fact that Tyson was so skilled. He had the big punch, and he was doing this in his era. But all things considered, like if it were a situation where it's the same level playing field as far as if Tyson was fighting in McVeigh's era, I think, yeah, he'd have that edge mentally. And if you really break it down, the difference between the edge that you give Sam McVeigh for his era, I think it'll translate to the current era or Mike Tyson's era, where with a lot of these older fighters, they were just different. They were tougher individuals, tougher men and women who laced them up in the sport are generally men. And I know there are a number of women that stood out later on, but it was just tougher back in that time of Sam McVeigh by comparison to the luxuries we have in Tyson's era and even more so in the current era that we're in. Now, I do feel that all of the individuals who are great in their respective eras would be great across the board in a number of other eras. And that's why I think the mental piece of it and having that fortitude and never backing down, that mentality of McVeigh would prevail in the case of the two of them meeting at any particular point. And McVeigh, he's not the type that would have actually, feared Mike Tyson walking in or coming into the contest, because he was just used to it. He was used to fighting individuals who were at the best level. Even they were friends, they fought each other so many times. So McVeigh fought Sam Langford, who arguably is the greatest fighter ever. and one of the top 3 heavyweights ever. And when he actually fought Langford, I think some of that was building blocks to him becoming better as a fighter. And Langford got the better of him in most cases. And I think that's because we view Langford and we know that he was one of the top dogs just in history. And I think just what he was learning from fighting these guys would ensure that he's kind of aptly prepared for what's to come. And Mike Tyson might come out storming, gutting, whether or not he outmuscles or outstrengths Sam McVeigh. That's a big question, one that I'm sure would provoke thought. But the limited footage we do have of McVeigh is him taking on, battling Jim Johnson, who is another solid guy from the era, solidly built guy, not the elite, a notch, or you could argue a notch or two below the truly elites like McVeigh, Langford, Jeanette, etc. You can see in that fight just how rough and tumble things were in that ring, and the close quarters. It looks to be one of the smallest that I've seen. It's not a very big ring, but the two of them were really just kind of battling it out. You got some clinching in varying spots, things of that nature, and these guys were very familiar with each other. But you just get a sense, and you can kind of see firsthand that McVeigh was a pretty sizable guy, and I do think his power, physique, all of that stuff translates beyond eras. And I'm of the notion that if you put one of these guys in another era, say that they continued on and continued to fight, and they just so happened to be fighting in the same era as Tyson, then I think that McVeigh, not much would change in terms of what he brings to the table from the mental standpoint, and some of the physical aspects would probably be of even more benefit to him in terms of what he'll have access to. So all in all, I do think that McVeigh, he would have been able to defeat Mike Tyson, potentially stop him, especially if you think about the actual time frame within Tyson's career. So he possessed some of those same tools, this being McVeigh, that Tyson had. And I think that is what would see him prevail, because he would adapt, he would overcome, and he had the chin to back as well as the competition to back such at an extreme level. So I'd certainly be leaning more McVeigh, either late stoppage or decision, but I'm going to say late stoppage.
Very cool, man. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you said there. Yeah, I mean, both guys were kind of finishing machines. They were known for being very hard hitters. I think perhaps, I mean, McVeigh, like Johnson and Langford, they all knew McVeigh was the strongest of the four kings of that era: Jeanette, Langford, and McVeigh and Johnson. He was the strong guy. I don't think even a prime Mike is going to muscle him around, but Tyson was very good at getting up close and delivering shots. I do think McVeigh is going to eat a lot of artillery early in the fight, but he is a fighter who can fight with straights and hooks on the retreat, and he's good at tying people up. In that footage with battling Jim, who's a hard charging big fella, you see McVeigh doesn't get overwhelmed by much heavier person than Tyson come barreling in. He's still able to do his thing and land in the clinch. I think it's just going to add up. So I think Tyson's going to hit him a lot, hard, frequently. But I don't think he's necessarily going to get a prime McVeigh out of there. And I think the fight does turn, because the way Mike comes in very dramatically, McVeigh was very educated, and he could fight going backwards. So some of those hooks are going to start to land on the retreat. He was able to do it on Langford, who though a short person, was an expert at beating up larger fellows than himself and had a long reach. Had a 73.5 or something like that. I forget his reach, but Langford had a respectable reach, comparable to a taller heavyweight, or at least mid-sized heavyweights like McVeigh. I think it's going to add up, but if Mike was excellent, so I mean, if early in the fight he does have a chance to, I think he will hurt him either way, but I don't think he'll get him out of there. McVeigh fought 20-round fights with Langford. He fought, some serious people. He was in there with Johnson even before he had a ton of experience. Challenged Johnson for the colored heavyweight title after Johnson had won it from Denver at Martin. Very early in his career, he's fighting a legend in his early, not quite in his prime, but Johnson was already legendary. By 03, maybe that's his early prime. Johnson's absolute peak prowess was probably more like 08. But as far as the combination of youthfulness and skill and experience. But yeah, I think I'd favor McVeigh, but not by much, because at his absolute best, Iron Mike was vicious, but he wasn't at his absolute best for very long as far as the professional ranks. And, as late as, say, 1915, McVeigh was able to beat Harry Wills. He also drew with Jeanette that year. I'm not sure how many rounds that fight was, but yeah, he was able to beat Wills after having lost those 4 in a row to Langford. I mean, he drew with Langford in 1911, and then at the end of 1911, he gave Langford his first proper loss in quite a long time. Since, as far as points, I mean, there was a newspaper decision Langford had with fireman Jim Flynn, which he then avenged brutally in a long fight, but he hadn't suffered an official loss since young Peter Jackson back in 06. So, yeah, so I think McVeigh has been in there with hard hitters, maybe not as overtly aggressive hitters as Tyson, but I think he fought fighters with better conditioning than Tyson, even though Tyson was really well conditioned. I don't want to sell him short. He was great in his era, but I think when you get up to the toughest of the tough, and a guy like McVeigh, who, yes, he lost to Jeanette, but it was 49 rounds, and he beat the pants off Jeanette for a lot of, not all, but a lot of the early part of the fight was severely in his way, and it was only because Jeanette was who he was that the fight wasn't stopped. And McVeigh was really good at catching guys, whether he could fight offensively. He fought guys who got on the bike, like he stopped Bill Lang, there's actually footage of Bill Lang fighting the great Sam Langford in 1911. McVeigh stopped him. He was able to fight guys who were mobile. So he was able to be a come-forward fighter, knockout puncher with both hands, but McVeigh could also fight on the retreat, and that's how he fought Langford. That's how he was able to get that points win at the end of 1911. Now, he did lose the next 4 times he fought the great Sam Langford, but after that, he came back to America. He beat Harry Wills, and Wills was perhaps not in his prime, but Wills was something like 22-2 when McVeigh beat him. He wasn't like a fighter with no fights, or he wasn't on his debut season. Harry Wills was already a beast by 1915. He's 23-3. Oh, that was the second fight. So he's 22-2-4. So if you think in terms of today, Wills was that first fight they had in 1914, I think it was. So he'd already had 28 fights professionally, Wills had. So if you take that today, there are guys who are considered top of the sport with only that many fights. So it's just that McVeigh, and this was recognized in the time, McVeigh, Langford, Jeanette, and Johnson had so much experience that other heavyweights couldn't overcome it. And so the advice, the newspaper writers were like, you got to get some of these guys and get them a ton of experience. Do just what these guys did. Build them up with tough fights, and then so that they can compete at the highest level. And by the time that happens, these guys will have aged out of the sport. And that is kind of what happened. Like you see in the late teens, a lot of guys getting a lot of experience. It had already happened. I mean, guys like Bobby Dobbs, Joe Gans, George Dixon, lots of fighters had already done it. But at the heavier weight classes, it wasn't always the case. And so people actually learned the craft of building up fighters into these great fighters from McVeigh and his great contemporaries. Jeff Clark, who gets far too little mention, was a very quality fighter who fought a tremendous amount at a Hall of Fame level. That's another thing, too. McVeigh's fighting long series, 15 fights against Sam Langford all across their careers around the world. That's an all-time great he's fighting, including fights against him in his absolute peak abilities, and even got a win over him right smack in the middle, or in his early to mid-prime. 1911 Langford was absolutely vicious. By the end of that year, he was, he was just scary. So McVeigh fought scary guys. So I think I'd favor him over Tyson. But if Tyson could keep it together early in the fight, capitalize on hurting him, which I do think he does, maybe he does win. So maybe if they fought multiple times, I'm not sure who that will favor, but maybe Tyson does get one of those. Or if in McVeigh's time, or maybe they fight to a draw. Maybe Tyson wins the first 6, and then the McVeigh turns the tide with his strength and with his grappling. He's going to stifle Tyson. He's not going to let him. He's not going to keep his elbows tucked and just let him do his thing. He's going to fight on the retreat. He's going to tie him up. He did this to Langford. Hold on, got scooters going by. So McVeigh was able to do this. We know he was able to stifle all-time great punching attacks. But Tyson didn't fight quite like Langford. His style, peekaboo, is different from that shuffling side stance. But but Tyson didn't have the high-level experience of a Langford. So maybe, that was it too. McVeigh had fought some guys at least, with more experience, more experience against greats. So he swam in deeper waters overall in his career. But also Tyson went away. Obviously he was jailed, but also his coaching staff got disintegrated, and it just. So at his very best, he was terrifying compared to the later version, who was still very scary. So yeah, I don't want to sell Tyson short. So maybe right at the peak of his prowess, he could get a draw in the early era if the fight's not too long. If it's 10 rounds, maybe they split the rounds. In a 20-round fight, I think that's enough time for a guy like McVeigh to wear him down, frustrate him. And McVeigh was very tough mentally. So I think, I think his calmness messes with Mike. Mike gets angry. McVeigh doesn't care. Fighting on the retreat, jabs and hooks. He obviously had a lot of discipline because he fought Langford. The first 2 times they fought, he was on the retreat. If the crowd didn't like it seems like the Paris crowd in April, and then in I think it was Sydney or Melbourne. I think it was Sydney, the first fight with McVeigh, 15,000 in attendance, if I'm not mistaken. They didn't like the decision. They thought, because Langford was doing the leading, McVeigh had the discipline, like certain fighters we can think of, to stick to the game plan if it's working, regardless of what the crowd thinks. So I think that mental toughness, that adaptability, fighting forwards or backwards, I think he's going to tick Mike off. And as the fight goes on, that's just a drain on the system. So I think, the mental game, Josh, that you mentioned, I got to agree with that. I got to lean Sam McVeigh, but not by a lot in the newer era with the slightly larger gloves and things like that, the mouthpieces. But in the earlier era, especially, Mike, prideful fighter, he gets a bloody nose, bloody lip, gets a cut, starts getting wild. McVeigh's just still doing his thing. Come on in. I'm going to jam that left in your face. I'm going to hit you with a hook if you overstep your bounds, if you lean too far forward. I think Tyson starts to come apart. I think he was made from incredibly tough fabric, but I think he was too emotional to go the full distance with a guy like McVeigh, who was, I don't want to say he was stoic. I don't know enough about his private life, but he was certainly in the ring. He had supreme discipline. So I got to lean with McVeigh, but these are 2 great fighters. I would love to see this fight. Hats off to both of them. I don't want to sell them short. I just think McVeigh swam in deeper waters for longer. And at the all-time great level, he was just in there a lot more. And I know Tyson fought, he was getting past it. Some of those fights against the greats, he wasn't the guy he had been. But McVeigh also fought when he was getting past it and fought greats. He was still in there, great fighters. So, I think advantage McVeigh. Would you like to move to the next one, or do you want to add anything, Josh?
I just wanted to add that another thing with McVeigh and his toughness, I know that while he was in Australia, he participated in some of these matches that were more akin to the MMA of today. And he was pretty much successful in those types of contests. And I think that just adds an extra wrinkle to how good McVeigh's game was. And if he can adapt to those types of circumstances, then surely he can bring all of these, or take all of the things that he went through and use that as motivation and a catalyst for him to be able to get to Mike Tyson in a way almost unlike he seen. So I just wanted to add that piece of it.
Word. Hey, there's fireworks going off on my end, so if you hear the banging, no one's getting shot. Just someone's getting this some more going through the stash. Not a lot of fireworks in this state, but
yeah, don't hear anything, or at least I don't hear anything.
Yeah, we're in between bursts, but that whole time you were talking, they were going off on the next street over. No big thing.
Okay, good.
It's only a state away. It's only like a 45-minute drive to where you can get fireworks, so people still have them. So, oh, you got joyriders on your end. Gotta love that city life.
It's crazy.
So I think we thoroughly covered that fight. It's a great fight. It'd be a real banger. I just think the tide would turn, but I do favor Mike. In a 4-round fight, I'd favor Mike.
Mm-hmm.
In a Jack Dempsey style, like early career Dempsey, like a 4-round fight, I think Mike would just hammer him with artillery and McVeigh wouldn't have time to add it up. But the longer it goes, the more I favor the Oxnard Cyclone. So I'm going to pull up the next fight. This one is even crazier. I don't even know how you can get crazier than that, but you can, because we're talking about fighters that come up mentioned as among the greatest all-round fighters of all time. Depending on which circles you're running in, both these guys will come up as some of the most skilled and brilliant and daring and fearless and just incredible fighters on another level. We're talking about the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford, and the great Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali. I don't know, these guys had long elite level careers, so you're going to have to fight a series, Josh City. What do you think about when you think about the 5'7.5", 44-inch unexpanded chest, barrel-chested, giant shoulders, long arms, Sam Langford against this phenom, Olympic gold medalist turned professional phenom, psychological warfare master of ring craft. Both men had uncanny senses of distance, timing, and everything, rhythm. These are two of the all-time great fighters. Josh, how does this strike your brain as you think about this matchup?
Yeah, this is one of the tough ones as well. This is very tough, just considering what we know of both fighters. I mean, you were breaking it down there. The size of Sam Langford, which never affected his ability to move up in weight and get a knockout or stop bigger guys, bigger men. In this case, it's like a clash of it's like the clash of titans, and a part of that is because these individuals are, in a sense, some very polarizing individuals in some sense. So the great Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time, self-proclaimed, and then it just took off. But certainly Muhammad Ali, that's a name that rings bells in the sport of boxing. It really needs no introduction. And the majority of the world, if you were to ask, they would know who he is. The Louisville Lip. But Sam McVeigh, another fighter that, when you take into account all of his accolades and what he was able to do and overcome, should be mentioned more amongst the likes of Ali, Lewis, etc. Other guys who were at the top of the heavyweight food chain, or at least the Mount Rushmore, just thinking about that type of stuff, and where McVeigh or Langford should rank. And with that in mind, I do think that it makes for a very intriguing matchup stylistically for the two, because there are certain things that Ali was able to do that many heavyweights in history are not able to do, or they just couldn't do it in a similar capacity to how Ali was able to do it. And I always say that he is so different in the sense that when he was talking about floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, I think he pretty much put that in motion, claimed it, and that's essentially what it looked like in the ring. Very graceful, could move all over the ring and not break a stride, could pivot, shift, and just bounce back or to the side, in and out whatever he chose, or based on how he broke down the fighter that he was taking on. Uh, Ali also one of the fastest heavyweights that the sport has seen. Pretty sharp with his punches, and you would have to keep up with him, which was tough for many as far as the first or the prime version of Muhammad Ali. Yeah, sticking to him and being able to get in and catch him cleanly was a tough proposition. Now, from what we've seen from Langford, especially in some of the videos that we do have of him that are out there on YouTube, actually, one of his great traits was surely his ability to cut the ring off. And we saw that in full force in his fight with Bill Lang, who was the bigger, heavier man, but wanted no parts of prolonged exchanges with Sam Langford, because he also came with a level of power that is amongst the best or the highest ranked punchers in the sport's history. And the interesting thing about such is that that power carried in weight. And so as he continued to move up, he did not lose stride as far as his ability to knock out bigger men. And taking that into account, size or size in itself, or the weight more so, I don't think would be an issue or nothing, or wouldn't be anything that he hasn't seen. And he's competed with many individuals who are a lot heavier than him. As a matter of fact, his first fight with Sam McVeigh, who we just spoke on, Langford gave up 40 pounds as far as the weight advantage. And that's a huge number, 40 pounds. So he certainly had the power there and the punch ability to potentially catch Ali with something. And then it would be a matter of how does Ali respond. And in the case of Ali, we've seen that he's one of the toughest the sport has seen, and he was in with some of the toughest the sport has seen, and he didn't back down at any point. As a matter of fact, in the latter half of his career, yeah, he wasn't moving as much, but he was still able to dissect opponents when he needed to, and when he could muster up that ability, that inner him, to carry him in those contests where age and youth was not on his side. Stylistically, I'm a huge fan of Muhammad Ali's style, as I was mentioning, and certain things or certain aspects could dictate how this fight is fought. For instance, I know that I've said this, but I think the version of Muhammad Ali that we saw completely annihilate Cleveland Dick Cat Williams, who was a puncher for his time, I think that was the best heavyweight that the sport has seen, and one of the best boxers, period, that the sport has seen. And I think when you take that into account, then you really get to see the absolute best of Muhammad Ali, just showing you that while he was doing things the wrong way in many cases, his IQ level was bar none. And he always worked it in a way that he knew where he needed to be and what his best punches and his strong suits were. So the mental capacity is also another thing. Now with Sam Langford, you could argue some of his best work came at lower weights as well, because he did rise from a lower weight, I know lightweight or maybe just under, and as he went up the ranks, he would rack up victories over some of the best, and in some cases where it should have been victory. And I think that looking at the level and caliber of heavyweights that he was in with, this being Sam Langford, I think that some of the things that would be at Ali's advantage, I think that Sam Langford would be apt enough to figure out how to step in and control things as best he could with what he had as far as his measurables. And of course, the punch is always there. And, and he had been taking on those bigger fighters, like I said, since early in his career. So stylistically, there may have been some who were great movers and could get around the ring, find their placement. But also, by that same token, I just really haven't seen another heavyweight who looks the way that, or at least who looked the way that Ali looked in his contest with Cleveland Williams, etc. Zora Fali, right there at the peak of his prime. And I think that is one of the more standout things because of the fact that you take a Sugar Ray Robinson, who many consider to be the greatest of all time, you take him and essentially blow him up a bit and throw him in the heavyweight division. That's essentially what it was like with Ali being in the ring and what he was able to do, what he was able to accomplish. And I think that speaks volumes in some sense as well. And just seeing the way Ali did it, it just helped, or at least when I think of it, I just think of how tough it would have been or may have been to just be in with him, trying to do your best to get to him when he could move faster. And he was solid enough as well to make sure that he could work it from his IQ standpoint, from his base, utilizing the jab, no stranger to it, and utilizing that excellent and amazing footwork that few have been able to duplicate. Now, when we talk resumes, both of them are top tier. And Ali, I mean, there's no question that he was in with almost all of the elite heavyweights of his era. And Sam Langford, of course, with the Fantastic Four, he was in with all of them. He was only able to fight Jack Johnson once, and he was smaller, more of a middleweight as far as his size was concerned when he did meet up with Jack Johnson. But taking that into account, I think that he would be able to handle the physical piece of it, but he would also need to be leery of just how elusive Muhammad Ali could be. And I think, as I had previously mentioned, the times can dictate things. And of course, they fought in longer fights in the time of Sam Langford, and certainly different conditions. Muhammad Ali himself, he fought through some tough situations. Of course, he essentially had his title stripped from him because of not enlisting in the Vietnam War. And he essentially was polarizing enough and went through enough that we know that he was able to overcome certain plights. And when he got back in the ring, even as he had probably moved from his prime, being away for that period, he was able to adapt his style enough that he was still successful. And the same was with Sam Langford as far as the duration of his career. And as he got older, still able to account for himself in with the elites of the division. And he would fight on. And as far as the fight count is concerned, it's not close because Langford, you're talking upwards of 200, 300, maybe even 400 fights, and that's a ton of experience. And now, as far as who he went up against, some of the best that were available in heavyweight, a number of them all-time greats, and a number of them carrying very different styles, at least from a scientific standpoint. But I think I can say that none of those individuals were Muhammad Ali, and that would be a tough bargain for McVeigh or Langford to deal with, probably in a series of fights, or just even in the first fight or one fight. I just think Ali had the adaptable enough IQ to be able to put himself in the right positions. And Langford's going to keep coming. He's going to keep charging. He is going to cut the ring off. He is going to rough Ali up at points, but Ali has shown that he can take it. And then it gets to the point of just how tactical of a fight or an approach either fighter takes. Um, would Langford stalk and be more of a quick strike Cobra type in there with Ali, just waiting, biding his time, not letting off anything huge until he knew it would land cleanly? And as far as Ali, would he continue to maintain the fight on the outside, utilizing his jab and footwork, and especially in his younger days, being able to carry that in the latter portion of fights? And I think when you wrap all of that together, I would give Ali the edge via decision, because Sam Langford wasn't someone you could just take out, knock out, and he could take a considerable amount of damage and dish it out as well. I think it would be one of the hardest fights that Ali would have fought, and we know that from a size perspective, or at least someone who was a bit smaller than Ali, though solid, was Joe Frazier, and those were some of the toughest fights of Ali's career, probably the toughest. So I have no doubt that Sam Langford would either be on equal footing or take over that mantle as the toughest fights that Ali would have gone through, especially if they fought a 3-fight series in a similar nature to when he took on Frazier. And with that in mind, I do think that in a series of contests, Langford probably finds a way to edge out or eke out a victory. And it's highly possible, especially if it were a longer fight. And even in a conventional or 12 rounds or a 15 rounder, which took off at one point, I do think that Langford wouldn't be out of his wits. He wouldn't be overmatched. He likely would be undersized, but I think that endurance, the mental strength, the mental capacity would ensure that he wasn't stopped or anything of that nature, because he would not give in. That was just his mentality and toughness. So I would say I would certainly lean towards Ali over this series, and just in the one fight with Ali at his absolute peak, it's hard for me to think anyone would have beaten Ali at that point. And with that in mind, that's why I kind of lean more on the Ali side. But there's really a thin line between great and great. And that's what this matchup essentially is.
Well, very well spoken, Josh. Yeah, excellent analysis, my friend. this is a real beast. There's so many layers to trying to figure out what happens in this fight because so like because they so Ali, we're talking about one of the greatest movers, one of the greatest senses of spatial awareness that the boxing ring has ever seen, and he's a big guy to be having that dexterity. He could, like Joe Jeanette was able to do this. Joe Jeanette, there's a famous photo of him doing an Ali style, like with the upper body leaning back to evade a hook from Carpentier in their fight. It's like Langford had seen guys who could do that, like with head movement using their leg strength, and he'd overcome that at times in his career. But I don't know that he ever fought anyone who could do it like Muhammad Ali, because I'm pretty sure Muhammad Ali is the greatest to ever do that. But he did fight jabber movers. He did fight guys who had very capable jabs. Joe Jeanette, phenomenal world-class jabber. The great Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, which I'm pretty sure is Jersey Joe Walcott's uncle. The great Jeff Clark, he could really move. In fact, Langford's people were always trying to make sure the ring wasn't too big because the Joplin Ghost could really get on his bike. He could punch too, but he could really get out of there when he wanted to. Ali was just a genius at that, at escaping. If there's something to counter that, Langford, we only have footage from 3 fights that survived. There should be footage, hopefully in some dusty basement in Australia, of him fighting Sam McVeigh in Paris, because that was filmed. And it was shown along with the Bill Lang fight in talks that Langford did, appearances, make a little extra money, probably put together by Hugh McIntosh in Australia. But, we only have 3 fights for Langford. We don't see him fight a mover like Ali. We do see him fight Bill Lang, who was fought a pretty tough schedule. He wasn't super experienced, across his career, not the way that Langford and even Ali was, but he was his fight Jack O'Brien style. He would like be moving a lot and then stop it, planting and throwing and stuff. And Langford at times would walk him down in a square stance, still ready to parry counter, still ready to jab the bodies, taking shots off the top of the head or parrying them with his forearms. Langford had a lot of ways to take punch. You can look at that nose. That's not even the end of his career. That's mid-career right there, that photo. He took a lot of shots because he fought a lot of heavy-duty cats, but he could eat it, and he was famously tough. I don't see Ali being able to out-jab him for the entire fight and move, because Langford's thing was he loved to punch the body, and he's one of...
Pour out my water?
Oh, hold on, mute yourself, Josh.
Oh, hold on, what's that?
Yeah.
Repeat that, random. Sorry.
No, I was just saying mute yourself. If you're talking off the thing, just mute your mic if you can. No big thing. No big thing. Because you got it turned. We turned it up to try and get a better balance, folks, on the microphone volume.
Hey, I was saying, did you pour out my water?
Oh, he's still on. That's okay. We all need water.
Well, yeah, I had put one of those little fruity tabs in there.
I'm sorry, I did pour it out.
Hold on, Josh. You're still on, brother. Anyway, so I don't think I could see Ali out jabbing Langford for the whole, unless it's a short fight. Short fight, Ali takes it on points. He's not going to stop Langford in the early rounds, I don't think. But he is going to win the early rounds while Langford's closing. The thing is, Langford liked to work the body, so the longer the fight goes, the more likely he is. Now, Ali was brilliant with the head movement, but if someone's, Langford was very happy. We see in the footage with Lang, especially, who's trying to mostly move in the circle. Langford's like diagonal steps, square stance, ready to parry counter. He's ready to bang the body under the jabs. He's ready to come with a giant overhand after jabbing low to the body. So he's not going to just, take it and just stumble around. He could move at a fair clip when he had his full mobility. He would be lighter than Ali. And I think if there's like an avenue for Langford in a longer fight, in a decently long fight. Oh, hold on, Josh said he got. All right, you're back, Josh. Oh, there you go.
Good to go.
But I think, yeah. So I think with Langford, he's going to be banging the body. He's going to, once he sees how the fight style is. Now the question, can he catch him enough in the early rounds to be really hurting him by the mid rounds to take over in the late rounds? But he also had like a vicious leaping left hook, and we know one of Ali's greatest rival, Joe Frazier, another of the great hookers. Langford had pretty decent reach. He didn't have Ali's reach, but he had a pretty decent reach, especially for a short. He had cartoon arms for a short guy, but he had a decent reach for someone who was like 5'11" or whatever, 5'10". He had a great leaping left hook, and he could throw. You can see it in Lang where he's bullying him. He's parry countered, comes under a punch, parry counter, left hook, knocks Lang off balance, straight walks him down in a square stance to the as he circles to the next corner, and then at some point shortly after that, he lands this beautiful straight right laser to the body, and then comes upstairs with a left hook. And taking into account the fact that Lang was circling away from that hook, it still caught him flush or close to flush, because he had that adjustment. He had that much experience against lower weight fighters who could really move. So Ali was fast. He wasn't the fastest fighter that Langford would have seen in his career, even though it would have been years earlier, which is worth thinking about. But again, we're talking about Muhammad Ali. He could punch. Those flurries were vicious. And if he uncorked some of those on Langford, it's going to be bad. Langford could take it, but there's also a point where it adds up. So I do think that early in a fight with Ali, he's going to take some damage. The question is, if they fight in the earlier era with the smaller gloves, how much of that damage is he going to take right on top of his head at the expense of Ali's jab hand? I think in the earlier era with the smaller gloves, no mouthpiece, I think it's a harder fight for Ali. Those smaller glove shots to the body, especially from a guy who specialized in banging the body, like Langford, Harry Wills, and lots of other guys said it almost didn't hurt. You got hit so hard. I think Harry Wills said he wanted to look behind him to see if his hand was coming out the other side. And you have to take that into account. As great as Ali was, as great a mover as he was, there were in an earlier era with those smaller gloves and different, maybe different rules. Some jurisdictions you could kidney punch, right? You could rabbit punch. And Langford was set real low. He wasn't easy to punch from the clinch. And so I think he's going to put damage on Ali, but I think the early part of the fight belongs to Muhammad Ali. Mid-rounds, at some point between rounds, maybe 5 and prime versus prime, 5 and 10, somewhere in that range, Langford's going to start. That body work's going to add up. He's going to find different approaches. He's going to draw from his wealth of experience and make it a hard fight. Now, depending on how long the rest of the fight is, I think it's a very close decision one way or the other. If it's like, say, a 15-round fight, I think it's very close because Ali was brilliant and he knew how to turn a fight back his way. So it's not going to just be like, it went this way, it went that way. No, it's going to, but I just think that Langford was very unique. And so some of the matchups that Ali had that he looked so good in, he wasn't fighting a short guy with a bigger chest than him who hit harder than probably anyone he fought. Same time, Langford never fought a mover just like Muhammad Ali. There hasn't been one at that size. So and Jeff Clark did get the best of him in one of their fights when Langford was starting to come in a little bit heavier. But yeah, I think prime versus prime, I think it's a very close decision. I don't think either stops the other. I think the body work does add up, but I think Ali owns the first part of the fight. In a finish fight, or a 20-round fight, I think I might favor Langford. It's going to pile up. You're a human being. It's hard, especially the way Ali would evade. Eventually, Langford would figure that out. He was one of the great ring cutters of all time. Even the little bit of footage we have, we can see that. He was one of the most fearless and had short power from both hands, smaller than Joe Louis. So I think that Ali-Lewis matchup works out a little differently, but because Langford was very quick and he had so much experience. I don't know if we've seen a world-class heavyweight who came up from lightweight, who fought world-class lightweights all the way up to, and then certainly not had a career at heavyweight the size of Langford's. So he'd have the experience advantage in the fight. So he might be able to draw from things he learned, but at the same time, Ali was a supercomputer and tough as nails. So I don't think either guy stops the other. And in a finish fight, maybe it would stop on cuts. Maybe one of them would get stopped just with cuts, swollen eyes or something, but I couldn't call it. Great fight. So I'm actually going to kind of sit on the fence. I think it's very close wherever they fight, but in a finish fight, I'd favor the fighter who fought more rounds, more experience. And in the smaller gloves, I'd favor Langford. In the larger gloves, I might have to go with very slightly 52% to Muhammad Ali. That jab, man, that jab. Langford he didn't have the same reach. I think he would probably give up about 4 inches in reach to Ali. That's a lot for the man to work with. Even if he's an expert body puncher, it's going to be a little harder than a long arm guy to reach him. Like Liston reached Ali's body at one point in the fight. He looked like he got pissed, and then he came in, and he was catching with some good shots to the body, but Liston had much longer arms than Langford. I think it's a tough fight for both guys. It's all-time greats. I think I give slight edge to Langford in his own era if it's 20 rounds or more, and I give a slight edge to Muhammad Ali, the great Muhammad Ali, in his own era. And Ali had access to more world-class heavyweights, but Langford had more fights against absolute legends. Langford's great rivals, Jeanette, 14 fights, McVeigh, 15 fights, Wills, at least 18. Depending on who you ask, it could be 22. Because of the way things are reported, sometimes papers would get the dates wrong in the reporting, and other times fighters would literally have fights on back-to-back weeks. So that's an ongoing thing in figuring out the exact schedules for some of these fighters. Yeah, great matchup. One of the all-time great matchups. But I think that in their own era, in their own comfort zone, I think each of them would have a slight edge. I would, and if Langford can, Harry Wills had an 80-inch reach, I think. I'm pretty sure it might have even been more than that. He had a longer reach than Ali. And so when they early in Will's prime, or just before his prime, when Langford was just past his prime, he was on the downside, he was able to beat Wills, who had a massive reach and was fighting at a high level already. So yeah, it's a tough fight. It's a tough fight. I think I'm gonna give each man his era. They fight it, or actually, you know what though? I can say if they fight in the English rules in 1911, say 1911 Langford in London or in Australia where you can't clinch, I think that favors Ali. If they fight in, say, California, where you can, like we see in the Jim Flynn fight with Langford and the third fight they had, which happened in 1910, lots of clinching. I think that edges it toward Langford. But maybe Ali could go back to the English rules where you're not allowed to hold and hit. You have to clean break. You can't hit on the break. Langford being able to hit on the break would be excellent for him because he had some of those vicious hooks in history. His left hook was absolutely brain melting. So yeah, I think the cleaner the rules, the more chances Ali can do his genius thing. The more down and dirty you can get, like the more not liberties, but the less restrictive the rules, the more Langford, his particular attributes come to shine. And in the smaller gloves as well, I think Ali would hurt his hands after a while. Langford he learned it from Barbados Walcott, or that he fought Walcott, who was an expert at that because he was only 5'1.5", but Langford 5'7.5". You could really ruin your hands on the top of this guy's head. So that might be a factor, but more so in the smaller gloves because Ali was able to use a flicky jab, and he wasn't a stupid man. He wasn't going to start breaking his hands up and go, I'll just keep doing this till they shatter. So there's the high fight IQ involved here. Both these guys at the highest levels, just inordinate amounts of high-level experience. And that the Ali that destroyed Williams, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to really think about Langford fights, like think about his best appearance. One of his fights with Jeanette that happened in Boston, I forget what year, 1910 maybe or 11, but it was considered one of the best fights that had ever been seen in the area. How busy it was and how just fanatically they fought. So.
Yeah. Very interesting for sure there, Random, if you're still there. But
oh, sorry, brother. Someone was talking to me. Just go ahead and add on the matchup or final thoughts. What happens? How do you think the gloves affect things?
Well, certainly if you took any individual or any boxer from this era and put them back then, certainly with their understanding and knowledge of today, yeah, they probably wouldn't fare too well. But that being said, if we viewed it from the lens of any great fighter adapting to the era that they're in, or a different era, just adapting and being managed taught, essentially fighting the same way. I think that you could essentially say that the best, the elites, they would be adaptable enough to gear their skill set surrounding the times. And that's just one thing to consider for sure, but certainly not the end all be all. This one's a very tough one. Surely tough, to sum it up in like a single setting. This could be an entire video on its own just because of just the legendary status of these two individuals and the regards they're held in. And I think that's what makes it a very intriguing matchup actually, and that's where the interest would peak.
Yeah, I feel you, bro. This is crazy. I feel like this would almost need to be its own show because we'd have to I'd have to like really go in deep. I don't want to speak too much on Ali, although I consider him probably the greatest, or certainly him, Langford, and Joe Louis to me are the tops. As heavyweights, all things considered, they each make their own argument. But I think Ali, it's almost like some people overrate him because of how good he was at talking, because it makes him feel good, and that makes him feel greater to them. But other people don't realize how tough his schedule was outside of his biggest few fights. And so even with the shorter career, even though Langford had just a heap of heavyweight fights, I mean, many dozens just of Hall of Fame heavyweight fights. Yeah, Ali's schedule was extremely tough, so I wouldn't write the man off. And I think, the cleaner the rules and in fact, the London rules with no clinching might even favor him more than his own era for Ali. The 1911, like where in Australia, where you have to, one of Langford's fights from McVeigh, the ref got overzealous, and they had to actually tell him to chill out a little bit because any time they got even close, he was starting to act like they were holding and hitting. It got extreme. So maybe the cleaner rules, Ali maybe even goes back and beats him in his own era. Although Langford punching at mid-range with the smaller gloves at the body is still a deadly thing, regardless of whether or not he can also clinch and hold and hit. But he was an expert holder and hitter. He'd fought guys who were brilliant at holding and hitting. So guys, Walcott and young Peter Jackson and a whole bunch of guys who could really slug you. They didn't need to be at range to slug you. Jeanette was one of those. McVeigh was able to do this. So it's tough, but I don't, at his very best, in his best moment, because part of it, he lost part of his prime, taking a stand on his principles. So he would have more, so at his very best, though, Ali was so special. I think unless there are you in the smaller gloves in the early era, I got to favor him. And if the rules are cleaner, I still favor him slightly, unless it's a 20-rounder. In a 20-rounder, you got to think that Langford, that was just another fight for him. He had bunches of them, including against McVeigh, with giving up 40 pounds the first time he fought him, 20 rounds to a draw, 4-ounce gloves, no mouthpiece. So he could go through it. He wasn't afraid of being hit. He fought harder hitters than Ali. I don't think he fought any guys that were Muhammad Ali's size who could punch in combination like Muhammad Ali. Maybe some of the lighter weight fighters, but as far as a guy, so that's another thing too. But I just don't think he can stop Langford, because Langford, even against punchers, everyone knew don't plant and just throw with Langford, because he could take it, and he was hitting so hard as he was taking it that you were going to lose that exchange. And that's why McVeigh fought on the retreat. Even though McVeigh could come forward and smash guys, he could be extremely aggressive, but he knew what was up. Langford just hit too hard, and we got to think, I'm not sure if you can look it up, but Muhammad Ali did not have a barrel chest like Langford. Langford was a cartoon. He was a little triangle. So when you think about how much bigger Ali's frame was at his best, he's not actually, when Langford pivots his hips and puts the damage in at close range. So that stuff that Ali did with Foreman, where he's hanging on him for parts of the fight against the ropes, letting Langford tag your body instead of Foreman, who was a great puncher, heavy puncher, but more of a wind-up. Langford was more like a Joe Louis short power. In fact, Joe Louis was supposed to be emulating the short power of Sam Langford via the great Jack Blackburn, his mentor, who fought Langford multiple times, and other than his jail stint, was around to see Langford in his prime. So, boy, this is tough. I'm just going to have to stop talking about it. This fight is so hard. The more I think about it, there's more layers. I went to 2 layers. There's probably 17 more. it's like string theory or whatever, for fight matchups. Just one of the great fantasy fights of all time. And if they fight a series, I think they're going to split the series. They might even fight some draws.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because they're just so great. And so, like, if they fought 15 times all across their careers, like, say, Langford did with McVeigh, or even 14 times like he did with Jeanette, yeah, they're gonna have some different results depending. And if they fought as old men, I guess we should touch on the old man fight. I think the older they get, okay, so Langford's eye impaired after 1917, but he's already past his prime by then. So I think as old men, I still think it favors Langford more because he had such concussive power. And Ali, as soon as he starts to lose his mobility, Langford's not as mobile either. But when Ali, his style kind of morphed, like many greats, Langford was really good. If he could grab you, he could, and sometimes if he couldn't see, like with Tiger Flowers, he couldn't, by the end of that first round, I don't know if he could see out of either eye, certainly not out of one because he didn't have use of it. And he still knocked him out. A very fast volume fighter like Tiger Flowers, even very, very old. So I think the older they get, when you get to them, when they're kind of old man fighters, I think Langford starts winning those fights if they fight that kind of long series. But earlier in their careers, I would favor Ali. Pre-prime, I would favor Ali. He's too big, he's too fast, he's too pretty. He's just too good. And Langford, I don't think, I think it was later when Langford had gotten into the meat of his heavyweight career. He'd had, like 1905, 06, when he's fighting, he's not even in a heavyweight. He's just fighting there sometimes. 07 maybe, but by 09, certainly by 1910, Langford is an absolute horror. And he hits so hard. It's like, you just got to look out. It's like when who did we match Fitz with yesterday, Josh?
Archie Moore.
God, I love that fight. That's another one. You see, you got to factor in the power of, if one guy has death power, it can change an equation because, like Fitz with Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, he was hugely smooth, but that power, you just got to look out. So this matchup, I would love to see a 15-fight series between these two all across their careers. Langford wins the later part of the series. It's very competitive in the middle. Ali wins the early part of the series, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, so Josh, I don't know. I'm free all night, but if you want to do another show today, I think we should call it now. It's another nice, tidy hour and a half, just over an hour and a half. But if this is it for the night, we could do one more if you'd like to. It's up to you, my friend.
Yeah, I think we can go one more. Yeah, that'll be. I'll be game for that. I think that'll work out.
Okay, so folks, listen, shout out to the chat, shout out to everybody tuning in afterwards. We appreciate you spending a little time on this, us nerding out about these potentially great fantasy matchups. Okay, so I'm going to do one of yours from your list because I think these might have all been ones I came up with. My fault. We'll do 3 of yours and one of mine next time. We're talking about, to me, the two greatest lightweights to ever compete. Although they're, depending on how someone measures, lots of guys have been great at that weight. It's a rich, storied division. We're talking about on the left, the eventually known as Old Master Joe Gans and the great Benny Leonard, the Ghetto Wizard. Holy crap, Josh! What do you think about this one, brother?
Yeah, huge matchup. Another tough one. Where I know this one has come up often. Especially thinking about these two as it relates to who many consider to be the greatest, or more so those that may feel a certain type of way about what Leonard was able to accomplish versus what Gans was able to accomplish. But essentially just a tough matchup, even matchup. 50-50 on paper. There are certainly strengths for both of these individuals. And I think that makes for an interesting contest just in general and how their styles would clash. In the case of Joe Gans, of course, first black light heavyweight champion, or first black champion of, I want to say, first black champion of American or African American descent to win.
That's right. You had Canadian George Dixon.
Yeah, because George Dixon, was the first, yeah. But Gans is the first African American descent to win a world title. When he won the world lightweight title, I believe it was via a victory over Frank Aaron, who was a very good fighter, top level fighter from that time. Now, I think that Gans is one of the more complete fighters in the history of the sport at his weight. And I mean, you name it, he could do it. He had all the tools on the technical side. Physically, he was conditioned enough, and as far as proportions are concerned, 5'6.5", 71-inch reach. I think that is something that will be factored in, as well as just the mental aspect and the IQ of Joe Gans. Now, he, like some of the great black fighters of that time or the period in which he fought, there were certainly situations where he was at a disadvantage. Some of them he was able to pull through. We often tie the Terry McGovern fight with him in terms of what was widely considered a fixed fight. Got both of them arrest warrants. Both had arrest warrants issued. They were banned from fighting in Chicago. So there were several circumstances that Joe Gans had to go through that would be big drivers in his ability to withstand it from a mental standpoint, whether that was verbally or non-verbally, as far as just some of the situations he was dealing with, the people who he was dealing with. By that same token, you could say a similar thing about Benny Leonard, who's many consider to be the greatest Jewish fighter ever. Of course, one of the greatest ever in general, and also the best lightweight, as we had mentioned. Now, Leonard, he had to go through some tough upbringing, poor. His nickname was the Ghetto Wizard, and I think that just speaks to where he was from, how he came up, the conditions that he was in, and I think that helped them develop this mentality, develop this tenacity, and just put in the type of work that he needed to put in to become one of the best at his trade. So Benny Leonard, he is almost essentially the equal to a Joe Gans. And just knowing what we know of each of them from a traits perspective, both of them could handle the situation depending on whatever situation it was that they were in. They would adapt and overcome, and they would continue to be who they are, regardless of what era you put them in, what your view of them is, if you're not as fond of the era. But make no mistake about it, two of the just greatest in general as it relates to the sport in itself. Now, Langford, or Gans rather, he was also one of the lightweights who had a punch as well. He's a part of the 100 Knockout Club, and I think that speaks to just how good he was, just from an all-around perspective. It's like everything you would want or seek in a lightweight for his time. And even to this day, just thinking about that, 101 knockouts. So he's a part of that club. And I think that is something that could play a factor in the fight in itself, because we know he had the type of punch to be able to get the job done. And in the case of Benny Leonard, and just one of the great tacticians the sport has seen, and also just the way he mastered timing. I think that was thing of beauty as well. We do have footage of both of these individuals, so the footage argument, or what some might use as a means for not really having a good enough understanding or being fully aware of these fighters. And when you take that into account, we have some footage on them, and we can see them operating. We can see what they look like stylistically. It's not a ton, but in fights that we have long footage, or at least long enough footage to really surmise stylistically how they mesh. And they would mesh well. Both true technicians in the sport. The reach edge goes to Joe Gann. So you think about the jab, both of them apt at it. You could probably argue Benny Leonard being a slightly better jabber, but I mean, that's really something you can't just measure per se. So you can kind of take it at face value, but if you just look how they fought and look at how they operated and the way that Leonard was able to maintain that distance and timing, it was because of the jab. And he had a good deal of knockouts himself. And he had actually fought in essentially at his peak, one of those guys that it was you'd just be hard pressed beating. And he, of course, retired and then had to come back due to financial reasons with the depression, all that good stuff, or things at a low. And that's when you saw more of a different version of Leonard. So you knew that he was sort of on the backside of his career. And some individuals were able to, defeat him. But that being said, he really handled it all as best as one could, at least as it relates to dealing with the competition that he was facing. But he only had 6 losses, so that essentially shows you that he was someone who more often than not, would be able to outperform his opponents, and his IQ would take him over or be in his favor. Similar thing with Joe Gann, another one of these things that would kind of play into his hands of favor. Didn't take a ton of losses. Wasn't an easy guy to just knock out, neither of the two. So I think that they'd be right there tactically for the full go. And one of the amazing fights on Gann's resume is when he fought battling Nelson in the 42 rounder. I think they went in the contest before battling Nelson was disqualified. But I think that just showed you that he was a man of the conditions, and he was really able to handle pretty much the majority of scenarios that one could see in the sport. And when you look at it from a competition standpoint, it reads like a who's who of the sport. Just thinking about some of the individuals he went up against, not only the big name individuals, but some of the contenders who don't necessarily get mentioned as much these days, but are some of the greatest. For instance, like George Elbows McFadden, one of the greats to never win a title. So individuals that most people, or people not too familiar with the history, would probably miss out on or skip over, but Gann's resume is littered with them because he was really in and doing great work in an early start to his career. Guys like Young Griffo of Australia, these are the types of individuals that not many people will know of, just thinking about some of the greats of all time, but they were in fact most certainly, without a doubt, some of the greats. Jack Blackburn, another one, one of the toughest, one of the great boxers that we've seen in the sports. Bobby Dobbs, the names go on. You can continue to list them. So he had one hell of a resume amongst the very best resumes we've seen in the sport. Now, Benny Leonard, he did also have a very tough resume, and both of these guys, pretty much 200 plus Fight Club fighters, and you have to think that going through that many fights, you pick up so many different things. So I don't think stylistically, or at least from an IQ perspective, that either of them would feel that they weren't meant to be there, or that they are at a disadvantage, or that they think that they would lose, anything of that nature. I think both of them have the mental capacity that they're not going to slack off, and they're going to come in confident, both with the intention of winning. And that's where it ties into sort of the tactics of the fight as well. Now, as I mentioned, both are in with some of the great competition we'll see, and you just have to break it down and kind of look at the fighters that they faced on their own individual merit. And it's not far off from a resume perspective. It's not far off. It's hard to even say which one had the greater resume, because there are so many top level names on both of them. You could argue a slight edge to Joe Gans, just given some of the individuals we know he fought. Barbados Joe Walcott, another one, a ton of others, which I might lean, but by that same token, you take guys like Ted Kid Lewis, Jack Britton, Lou Tindler. I mean, those are individuals that would stack up well against pretty much any resume. So they're very close in a resume perspective. And yeah, this is one of those contests where not a lot separates the two. So it's hard to say who would win just kind of straight up. And you really, I would say, are doing both fighters an injustice in picking one, because they were just so very good and so on top of their game. And when they were champion, yeah, it was no question that they got there and they fought their way there the hard way. They had to go through a certain level of competition to get to that point. And when the opportunity came, they jumped on it. Now, both of these guys could dish it out and take it. So I don't sense any fear in the ring for either of them. We'll start to lean toward the conditions at that point. And as we know, Joe Gans was in some very long fights. But I also think that a guy like Leonard, being in 40-plus rounders, would adapt and do what he needs to do to get through in one of those contests if the two of them were fighting. Now, much like some of these other guys, yeah, the time frame, the place they were at in their career, that could dictate things. Because, as I mentioned, maybe a longer fight, maybe that goes in Gans' favor. Maybe in a shorter fight, that goes in Benny Leonard's favor, especially something under 10 rounds or under, maybe even a 6-rounder. If Benny Leonard got out the gates quick enough, yeah, there's a potential he gains that edge on him. And I use Jack Blackburn as an example, another master boxer during Joe Gans' time. And in a short 6-rounder, Blackburn got the better of Joe Gans. He actually won and showed that he was on par. And Gans' manager is actually quoted in stating that they did not want to face him in anything under 15 rounds. So I'd imagine a similar scenario would apply to Benny Leonard. Joe Gans would be geared towards the duration. He'd be hardened for the conditions and any potential attrition. And we've seen how that has played out in his favor in a number of scenarios when he was there in the ring. And then he had the pop to pretty much end the fight if he found the opening. And I would think that he would adapt himself and he would come in focused, because there were times when Gans didn't come in focused. He didn't train up to snuff as far as the way he probably should have. But that being said, a focus Gans, completely different story. And Benny Leonard himself, not a guy that you can just simply break, especially in his prime. So this would likely be the toughest fight, or arguably, I should say, the toughest fight for either of them, just given what we know of the two fighters. And I think that it would probably go to distance in some capacity. And certainly in a series of fights, I could see us exchanging wins, or see each of them exchanging wins. And I can also see, you just put them at their best, it could potentially being a draw, especially if you take the way things operated at the time. Say it was a referee or single judge or something of that nature rendering the decision. I could surely see this as being a draw, just because I think both of those guys would be pretty much even in so many different areas that it would be hard to pick a definitive winner, and you could be potentially swayed by certain things. So I think a draw would probably be the apt verdict if they were to face each other, especially thinking about it when Games was fighting, and with those same type of conditions and stipulations. I do think that, Leonard at his best would be able to hang in there right neck and neck, and he showed that he has enough tools, or enough of the boxing IQ, enough of the footwork, and just keeping himself out of harm's way, whether that's stepping back or moving to the side, ducking and slipping punches. So I have no doubt that he'd be full steam ahead if matched up with Joe Gans himself. And really, it ends up making it a very, very tough scenario just overall, because you don't want to take anything away from either of these fighters, just given the fact that we know that they are just amongst the elite of elites. And we think about it, and as I mentioned with that separation, you're talking minimal or very incremental, small, minute amounts of differences with them at their absolute best. And we've seen in some fights, even here in modern times, when you get those types of matchups, it goes the distance. I think both of them would have the chin to go the distance. And I think both of them would be adaptable enough that whether they were fighting in the late 1800s or the 1930s, 40s, 50s, etc., then they would still be the level of fighter that they were. And I do think that these two would have been champions in those same eras. And back to the conversation surrounding, or a conversation is always recurring surrounding the evolution of fighters. These are the two types of individuals that would have been in with and seen pretty much any style and have the IQ and mental fortitude to be able to adjust their game to deal with such. So I think they are so translatable just completely across the board that it's one of those tough matchups that as I mentioned, taking anything away from either one, is a hard thing to fathom and surmise. So that's why I say it's in all likelihood, whatever scenario they're in, it goes the distance. I believe that's probably the more apt decision. And for my money, I say it's a draw.
Yeah, man. Great talk right there, brother. It's uh it's a tough one. I mean, some of the ones I wanted to bring up weren't so obvious, but this is one that was from your list that was just spot on. These are for a lot of people, Joe Gans was the best of them all. Like George Dixon, little Georgie Dixon, little chocolate, a Canadian fighter who fought out of Boston. He's actually buried about a mile from here in Mount Hope Cemetery. He was considered that, like, hey, he might even in these like sort of racially charged times, certain fighters were so great that people had to tip the hat. And by the time Gans had been going, because people were trying to say he was past it in like 1902, then again in 1903. They might have said it before, but it was a while before he actually lost the title. And Gans has fights off the record. He fought in private. Sometimes it was in the papers. If it was legal to fight in private, then obviously, if it isn't, the rich patrons want to bet on your fight, and you're going to bet on yourself, or your managers are going to bet. Everyone's going to be betting in every direction. You may not be always a good idea to have in the paper. So I think Gans has like maybe 199 or 200 known fights, at least on BoxRec. Who knows how many fights he was actually in, but he fought greats across multiple weights, including welterweights. Fought a draw in 1904 with the great Barbados Joe Walcott. So Leonard was older, to my understanding at least. Leonard in his comeback was at welter, and he ran into the great Jimmy McLaren, and that was the end of the comeback. But his wins at welter weren't necessarily he didn't necessarily have a whole lot of world-class welter experience. So Gans, as a lightweight, was able to fight, great fighters who are. But that's not to say he didn't have weight stipulations wanting fighters to make a certain amount of weight ringside. I think lightweight was 133. I don't know if that stayed true through his whole title reign or his whole contendership plus title reign, but he had things where, like, okay, so you got to make 138 ringside to fight him for the 133 title. So it's like almost like a rehydration clause. He did some of that, and but he fought Barbados Walcott up at welterweight. It was just a non-title fight in the end. So, in this time, guys would travel weight classes, and his resume is absolutely ridiculous. But both these guys are all-time greats. To me, they're the greatest of the lightweights, although there are arguments for other people depending on criteria. But resume-wise, they have gigantic, elite-level resumes and huge overall success. They fought in different times. As far as what they said, Leonard, it was reportedly, he said that, which other boxers have said about the greats of the past, but he said, if you thought I was good, when people say, like, you're the greatest lightweight, if you thought I was good, you should have seen Joe Gans. I'm pretty sure that's been attributed to him, among others. So, but that he's nodding the hat to this great fighter, this somewhat tragic figure as well. Like the Gans didn't get to live out into, old age and get the praise from later generations and be out there. He died young, and he was still world class past his prime when he was succumbing to, disease. Like it was a rough time. Gans saw a lot. He went through a lot of shit in his life, in his fighting career especially. But yeah, I think the shorter the fight, the more likely I am to pick Leonard. Gans had fought short bouts. He fought challenge bouts. He was supposed to fight Sam Langford. He'd lost to him on points over 15 rounds. That was his. While he was the lightweight champ, but in a non-title fight. But then he was supposed to fight him again the next year in the 1904 season, but then Langford was going to come in heavy. Again, he couldn't make 138 ringside. So instead of having the fight at 140, which they had done previously, it looked like it was going to be around 140. There were some excuses. There was laughter in the press. Like the Gans manager was laughing at the fact they said he hadn't been training. He's basically saying, he's had plenty of time to train. He's just been partying. He's just lazy. But anyway, so they didn't fight. And instead, Gans did a challenge match with young kid Griffo. You can last 10 rounds. The club was going to put up $50, I think, a round, or 50 or 100 a round for every round past 10 that Griffo could last. Gans would give up the winner's part of the purse if he could stay the distance, or if he could last past 10. He didn't last past 10, so Gans knew how to turn it up. He had plenty of that in his career if it was a fast fight. But I think Leonard was so brilliant technically. Early in the fight, the first 3 or 4 rounds, Leonard is going to have an advantage. He's going to have some tricks that Gans won't have seen, or won't have seen expressed in such a complete fighter as Benny Leonard at that weight. His particular flavor, but I think Gans very quickly, in either era, Gans very quickly adjusts, and he was someone who set very deadly traps. There's even one of him. He jabs the opponent in the armpit. I think it might be a counter to a cross, but I can't quite remember. But he jabs him in the armpit to lock him in place and knocks him out with the other hand. It's absolute poetry. And he set traps, and so the longer the fight goes, these traps that Gans would set, all the different approaches and stylistic approaches, the ways he could fight, all this inordinately long list of powerful fighters, different stylists, different weights he'd fought, including at welterweights, dealing with some hard hitters. So, Leonard could crack, but Gans had fought Barbados Walcott in 1904. I mean, Walcott was the guy who could hurt much larger men than himself, especially with his body punches. Gans was okay. They fought to a draw. So he could take it. I don't see Leonard stopping him unless it's like on cuts possibly, but I don't think so. I think I would favor Gans the longer the fight goes, the earlier the rules are, the rougher the rules. Gans fought in some rough times, like in the fight, the 42nd round, the DQ, the battling Nelson. He'd been headbutting repeatedly, and the crowd was even jeering for some of the low blows and headbutts and like some of the fouling. Apparently, I wasn't there, of course. But that seems to be what happened. So it wasn't like other eras where if you straight up headbutt the guy, they're like, stop, that's a foul. That's what are you doing? Like, he was getting fouled a lot in that fight, and that was 42 rounds in of a hard knocks fight. So I think the further back you go, Gans knew all those tricks too himself, even if he didn't always employ them. I think the further back you go, the more likely I'd favor Gans. So I think 15 or more rounds, or maybe anything other than a 4-rounder, I think I favor Joe Gans. In a 4-rounder, I think it's pretty close because they could both go. They were both very fast, good footwork. And this would be one of the greatest fights of all time. This is, I think in Leonard's time with less rough stuff, I don't know if that necessarily is disadvantageous to someone as brilliant as Gans. I mean, he was one of the great stylists of that whole early era, from when they started putting gloves on until, you could say all the way up to like losing the title. We saw a lot, and he was very, very influential. And guys like Langford thought he was the best of them all. He said you couldn't read anything he was doing. Like, he didn't telegraph, and his face he didn't do anything with his face. Like, he was so calm in there, and he had all these tricks. Langford considered him to be the best. At least by 1924, that's what Langford was saying. Sometimes fighters change their minds over their careers, but safe to say, Joe Gans, and including Benny Leonard, idolized Gans. I mean, he was so. It's a tough fight, but I think in a shorter fight, Leonard's chances go up. From whatever they are, they go up. He had a huge bag of tricks, gigantic. He just like Gans. He wasn't afraid of a busy schedule, so he stayed in shape. He was just fighting, and both all-time greats, real tough men. Gans lived in a harder time. He had a physically harder life just because of the special circumstances of his particular career and the times he had to fight through. Because things changed a lot from when he started in the late 1800s and went, by the time of his tragic passing, not too far into the 1900s. Decade in. Rest in peace. These guys are fantastic. So these are both like among the absolute greatest of their respective eras. Mm-hmm. And Benny Leonard just used to be a name to me because I'd hear people, I knew Sugar Ray Leonard, just sort of casual, hearing stuff, watching stuff. They're like, the great Benny Leonard. I'm like, this is when I was younger. Not necessarily on YouTube, but maybe on TV or something. And I'd be like, whoa, is that another nickname for, I only know one Leonard? But then later, when you start studying, and the resume is absolutely ridiculous, and carrying the torch for boxing in many ways. Like he was a great man, as was Joe Gans. So we're not comparing greatness, just like ring prowess and a head-to-head fight. Yeah, they got to fight a series, Josh. They can't just have one fight. You kidding?
Yeah.
So it's going to be 5 fights. As prospects, I favor Gans. He fought tough schedule before he even won the world lightweight title. He'd already fought Hall of Famers. He already had wins that in a multi-belt era would have been title fights. That's true of both of them. In the multi-belt era, they would have been champs long before they were. And, with the colored titles, that there were multi-belt eras, but to some degree in certain weights at different times. But yeah, I think so. It's like you can't just look at title fights, but they were both great champions. They were also great in non-title fights. They did it all. I think advantage Gans in a finish fight. I think Gans is going to finish. His trap's going to add up. He's going to get him out of there. As low as, say, 10-rounder, I think 10-rounder may be a draw, or Leonard wins on points the first time they fight. As the series goes on, I start to lean heavily toward Gans. The guy was a computer. If only he had lived and coached, the sport would be so much better off. I mean, he's a pivotal figure. He's like Jimi Hendrix. What if Jimi Hendrix had lived and played guitar into his 50s and 60s, been like a David Gilmour, just kept playing epic guitar? How much richer would music, would rock or blues or all kinds of music be if some of these greats had lived? So Gans, Jack Blackburn, fortunately for boxing, stayed around, trained a lot of great fighters, including one of the real all-time great big men, Joe Louis. So Gans didn't get to live that part of his life. Leonard, I think didn't he have a heart attack reffing?
Yeah.
So he went out, he lived his life boxing. I mean, he literally went out on the show. So rest in peace, both these greats, both tragic figures to some degree, because Leonard, his comeback, he lost so much money in the financial devastation of that time. Like that was his way back. But Gans also had times of extreme poverty in spite of making a lot of money. And yeah, in a fight, I think the longer fight in the possibly smaller gloves, or even skin tight gloves, I think Gans takes it. The more time he has to explode those traps and set up patterns, he could work in very long, overarching patterns and traps. And that's something was said about him from a lot of people. Like he was baiting. There were things he would do that you may not, without putting words in anyone's mouth, apparently there were things Gans would do that would pay off rounds later. Like he was building. He was very methodical. So trying to think of a larger fighter who was like, look at the way Rocky Marciano fought. He sacrificed. He'd eat jabs. He's coming in close, but he's working the body. He's doing his work. Tight uppercuts and hooks to the body. He's like putting in the work. He's patient. He's not rushing. He's got a pace he's setting. Gans was like that with tricks and traps, and he could really hit. So I think overall, I think he was slightly the better of the two. Overall, just the way I weigh things, the resume is very close. These are probably both top 15 or top 20 if you have other favorites, like all-time greats across any weight in boxing. These are all-time great fighters. And at the lightweight, it's hard to make an argument for someone else. If you really look at the resume fight to fight, the overall size of the resume and the greats they fought and the conditions they fought under, I think these are the top 2 guys. So yeah, I don't want to call it, but I think there are a lot of scenarios where they fight to a draw, a bloody and brilliant draw. But in the longer fight, if it's 20 rounds or more, I got to go with Joe Gans. I think that's all I have to rant about that. What a pair of great fighters. I'm so glad we got to bring these guys up.
Yeah, certainly are. And I did just want to say, yeah, you made some very compelling points that kind of leads me or sways me more in favor of Gans as well. But certainly close. Just thinking about some of the things you shared and taking into account. Now, I do rate Joe Gans as the greatest lightweight of all time. So I guess that kind of says such in some notion, but definitely very interesting. And indeed, I know you were noting the tuberculosis. So Gans, he was still fighting. I'm no expert on tuberculosis. They say it lays dormant, or it can be dormant, and essentially what it does is attack your cells, the bacteria spreads and it affects the lungs, which you have to think or we know is a critical piece of this. You competing in any sport, let alone boxing, that's a critical thing. Being able to have that endurance, and if there's something affecting your lungs, then yeah, it can potentially handicap you in varying stages. So he would have likely had TB for a period while he was boxing there at the tail end of his career, and being only 35 at the time that he passed. So I think that's something that you can take into account for the latter portion of Gans' career, and know that he was still able to compete at a high level even with tuberculosis, in dealing with whatever the severity of it was at that particular time before it turned into this situation where he actually passed away.
Yeah, that's true. He was going through a lot, and it's the later part of Leonard's career was like he was largely successful in his return until he ran into McLaren, and but he just didn't have it. McLaren wasn't a tiny person. He wasn't a. He was. You could see in the fight in the footage. The rough go. McLaren was an incredibly great fighter himself. So he just ran into another of the all-time greats. Because Jimmy McLaren, his strength of schedule is absolutely ridiculous. The latter part of his career, especially fight to fight to fight, you're like, wait, how many of these guys are Hall of Famers? He literally fought the who's who. Like, no one fights everyone, but Jimmy McLaren for a quote unquote shorter career, I think 69 fights or something, is absolutely. It's like looking at Muhammad Ali's career and you'd be like, oh, that's right, man, this guy packed it in. So McLaren has a career like that, except at the Hall of Fame level, it was ridiculous. Another of the all-time greats who fought many of the all-time greats. And that's what these guys are. These guys, they're Hall of Fame experience, like, or even just like top contenders and champions of Hall of Famers and all like the top echelon of the sport. And in Gans' case, across multiple weights, these guys, and Leonard may have dabbled before he actually moved up to welter. He may have dabbled at the other weights. I don't know his career well enough, so I don't want to act like I know him even as much as Gans, which isn't that much for either gentleman, a little bit for Gans. But yeah, these guys are among the greatest to ever do it. And they were both celebrated in their day as just absolute phenoms. Because the heavyweight division's the marquee, but that doesn't mean that people, the overall draw, like people who know what they're talking about, like who they think the best who's doing it is, regardless of actual size. That's the position these guys had. They were really that great. So this is one of the all-time great fights. Hopefully they would fight at least 5 times, even if you had to, you just make some jumps in the time machine. But yeah, Gans started off tough, and people were thinking he was done years before he lost the lightweight title. And he just a magnificent run, and but Leonard's career as well. Like, yeah, it's a tough one, but I just think Gans, he was so pivotal. Leonard was a great fighter, but Gans was so pivotal. So many pivotal people learned a lot of their tricks from him. He came up. George Dixon as well deserves a lot of credit, but like Gans was one of those guys where people, and he had a ton of fights. So if you could get to one of those many, many fights, you can see him in person doing his thing. That one clip just stayed with me, where he's intentionally punched the guy right in the armpit, and you see it, like he kind of just stops from place and bang, and then that's it. Have a good one. Just brilliant. Like he's able to do stuff like that. And I think even someone as clever as Leonard, the longer the fight goes, Gans is gonna, in either era, in the rougher era or in the slightly more stringently refereed era that Leonard was in. Still a rough era. It's no joke back then. As 86. All of this is dead serious stuff. So yeah,
No doubt.
I think this is close, but I could see a draw as well. Like these guys were adaptable, and even if Gans had like some deep, ugly fight rules experience, like Leonard wasn't some tender gentleman. He was a hard man himself. So yeah, I think it would just be great in any era. Although the earlier, the less rules involved or the less restrictive rules, I think Gans, he was so good dealing with that stuff. whether or not he chose to dish out himself, but he was just, they called him the old master. He was in his like late 20s by then. I think he was already being called the old master because he was so experienced. People keep saying he was done. I'm not sure when exactly he picked that one up. People kept saying, I see in the papers, the people, Gans has gone back. They would often put it that way if you're starting to slip on the downside. They've gone back. I guess that means gone back to not being relevant. I don't know exactly. I'd have to research that. But yeah, but Gans, terrific fighter. If someone like Langford, who saw it all, gave him the shout out as the greatest of them all, that's a pretty heavy endorsement. And I'll also take Benny Leonard's endorsement that Gans was the greatest at that weight, because he wasn't, all these competitors are tough, prideful in some ways, but like, Leonard was a thoughtful character. So if he says it like that was the guy, then that Langford and other guys' endorsements, yeah, I think overall, but maybe that's partly resume, what they actually did. Some of that Gans had to do because of the circumstances and who his manager was and what he was expected to do to make enough money for everybody and live the life he wanted. So yeah, tough fight. And folks, did you think it could get tougher when we hit something like Tyson McVeigh or even like Ali Langford? I said it's going to get tougher and tougher. I wasn't kidding, right? I'm really as I'm talking, I'm still struggling with this fight. You know what it's going to be like? You know what? It was going to, maybe next time we should promise the folks one of these next shows we're going to do Ray Leonard and Ray Robinson.
Oh yeah.
Prime versus prime. I think welter is a fair place to have them fight. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But that's like,
I think that will work.
Like by the end of Ray Robinson's welter career, it was absolutely ridiculous. And there's a reason he was up there, there's a reason that across his career he was held in such high esteem. But in an actual fight between him and Ray Leonard, there's a lot of factors there. But at the very best, if they can, when they can make welter, dude, that's a killer fight. We're definitely doing that, folks. We're definitely doing that next. That's going to be an hour of the show, brother.
For sure. So yeah, I look forward to it. Definitely. These have all been intriguing, and I still kind of go back and forth in my mind some of the areas that I had led to, or at least that I favored surrounding who would win, and it definitely invokes thought, just even more thought about everything, because you think about breaking down any of these fighters. And of course, we spend our time talking about it and touching on some things, but realistically, there's so many facets to it that, yeah, there are probably some things that are being missed. Could dedicate an entire show to matchups of this magnitude and just really break down and dive into their careers, their overall development, things of that nature. So I enjoy the toughness of it, and then just kind of trying to think about how to best pin or piece together certain things that would give you a picture of what, may have very well been the outcome. Keyword may.
Yeah, I mean, it's all speculation, but it does, in my mind, anything where we're honestly celebrating all these different versions of greatness in such a tough endeavor is combat sports, martial arts, combat sports, sports entertainment as well, because fighters build their brand by being entertaining. So there's multiple layers of enjoyment for us, and something raw about it. It's an ancient craft, just fighting for entertainment. So I think, I just hope we're showing the proper respect to these guys for it's irrespective of who they were in their personal lives, but just showing the respect for the how dangerous and how involved this is especially at this all-time great level, because lots of these guys swam around with great fighters. So when we say Joe Gans and Benny Leonard, it wasn't like them, and then it's just like in any given time where there's there's a few other guys. No, these guys fought in really rich eras where lots of people had crazy schedules, and it was like seasons of sport, seasons of the roughest sport there was. So it's crazy times. Big shout out to them.
Indeed.
And thanks, folks, for tuning in. So what did we end up doing? Just as a recap, what did we end up doing? I'm not going to actually go into the fights again. So what we did, Lewis, Jeanette, right?
Yep.
Boy, that
Tyson
was,
McVeigh.
yeah. So we did us Lewis Jeanette. So that was quite a talk. Yeah, McVeigh and Tyson. How many did we do today? I don't even remember.
Remember
We did
Ali and
Langford and Ali.
Lewis?
Boom. What did we start with? Oh yeah, we started with Jeanette Lewis, and then we did this one. We did Benny Leonard,
Oh yeah, yeah. That.
and the old master Joe Gans. So this
Also
is
four of
all.
them.
What's that, brother?
So four. We got through four again.
So last time we did 4 in an hour and a half. It took us almost 2.5 hours this time, but it was well worth it. These were tough. These matchups are going to get tougher and tougher. We haven't even begun to like tear brains apart. Especially like we're coming in with some left hooks, man. We're doing some feints, throwing some feints in here because Jeanette Lewis is not a fantasy matchup. I think I ever remember seeing someone like, yo, what I would want to see, Joe Jeanette, Joe Lewis. But you start thinking about that fight, looking at the resume, looking at how they fought, you'd be like, wait a minute, this is an absolute monster. So we got other fights, and then other ones that'll be more obvious. Like this is one for people who love boxing history. This is a natural super fight, all-time great super fight. So we tried to deliver that as well. And for people who are deep in the streets, this one right here is very intriguing. Although I think a lot of people would favor Ali because how he moved. But yeah, this is quite a battle too. Well, 86, I appreciate you joining me, brother. I think it's probably time I get some food in me and stop talking. I've been babbling for hours. Thank you for joining me, folks. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you got something out of this. And we'll have another episode coming up. I'm not sure when. Just look for the notification. And thanks for joining us to talk a little bit about martial arts and combat sports. 86, any closing thoughts?
Hey, I just want to say once again, thank you. Definitely appreciate being able to come on and discuss these varying fights, potential scenarios, fantasy matchups. This is probably one of the more appealing things that the sport of boxing offers, because there's always a mythical matchup or two that surely gets people's ears ringing and makes them put on their thinking cap. So I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next one.
Awesome, brother. Well, thanks for joining me, and folks, thanks for tuning in. As always, I just hope you have just a fantastic day, and we'll be back soon enough with another episode. Take care.